Welcome to Murder Mile UK True Crime. This isn't a video, it's an audio experience. The only images you'll need for this episode are these. So close your eyes, open your mind, and savour the sounds of Murder Mile. Wednesday the 14th of April 2004. H&B Belmarsh. Slamming, banging, shouting, screaming. That isn't the sound of what Peter says goes on inside his head. That is his new reality. For 7 weeks, 23 hours a day, he's been cooped up in a tiny 6-foot by 8-foot cell, staring at 4 grey walls, a locked steel door, and his barred window giving him a sickly view of an A-road, a business park, and Woolwich Crown Court. Wearing a prison-issue blue t-shirt, grey jogging bottoms and black plimsolls, his eyes are cracked and red from a severe lack of sleep, as although he's revelled in the headlines, comparing him to Hannibal the Cannibal, dubbing him Peckish Pete and Britain's most dangerous man, inside, he's surrounded by the epitome of evil, seriously deranged men who kill and torture without motive or mercy. In here, he's nothing and nobody. A tabloid reputation is nothing if he can't back it up. And as his crimes have proved, Peter Bryan only picks on the weak and the vulnerable. An unarmed girl, her 12-year-old brother, a disabled man, and a 16-year-old child. He lies, brags, and manipulates to get whatever he wants. And it's possible he staged a crime, as he's terrified of serving his sentence in a place like this. Smashing up his bed, shouting and screaming about voices goading him to kill. It could all be real. But he knows his symptoms better than anyone. Definitely the guards, and maybe the prison psychiatrist. But with his trial approaching, if he's convicted of murder, he'll serve his sentence right here. Told in full for the very first time, this is Schizophrenic, the real fake Peter Bryan, Part 5. Thursday the 15th of April 2004, the next day. A G4S prison van enters a second set of high-security gates at Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital in Berkshire. Exiting the van with a slight limp, although bound and shackled in an unfamiliar place, Peter is as calm as a Hindu cow, as it's not unsimilar to Rampton Hospital. Broadmoor, as the press love quoting, has housed hundreds of the UK's most dangerous psychotic patients, such as Daniel Gonzalez, Peter Sutcliffe, Robert Maudsley, Graham Young and Robert Napper. To some, it may seem dark and foreboding, but as Peter is handed by prison guards in blues to psychiatric nurses in whites, it has a cushy comparative comfort, with calm wards, big windows, single occupancy rooms, doped up patients, CCTV, alarms, a chance of day trips, a gym, and if he's a good boy, Ribena. As a former Victorian asylum, Broadmoor has often been criticised as overcrowded and dangerous. In the preceding years of 2005 and 2007, there were 95 serious incidents, such as suicides, attempted suicides and murders. The accommodation was described as substandard, with some patients sleeping on sofas because there weren't enough beds, and they continually struggle to find enough staff to cope. As was standard practice, upon admission, Peter's medical file was handed over, and given his crimes, he was put into seclusion. An inquest later stated, it's uncertain whether those files were read and understood by the staff. It also criticised the pre-admission nursing report, an inadequate mental state examination, a formal written risk assessment, and how often he was seen by the medical staff. described as rushed and inadequately assessed, with Peter said to be calm and placid. After 3 days, he was removed from high-security isolation and placed on a medium-security Luton ward. He was allowed to mingle unsupervised, take his own medication, and was put on general observations rather than 15-minute checks, given the danger he presented, as the hospital was badly short-staffed. He was said to be calm, jovial, and trustworthy, a model patient. Yet had they read his medical file in full, several quotes would have jumped out.
Peter is hard to assess.
His symptoms are inconsistent.
He's a paranoid schizophrenic, but his only symptom is paranoia.
He masks his illness.
He appears utterly charming and normal.
He has conned and manipulated people by telling them what they wanted to hear. He got out of Rampton, John Howard, Riverside, and Newham General. And Broadmoor was next. But first, he had some unfinished business. The family of Richard Loudwell would state, Richard had complex psychiatric and medical needs. We expected that people would be kept safe from Richard, and that he would be kept safe from others. But the system would fail him, just like it would fail him and his victims for many years and decades. Born in July 1943 in Chatham, Kent, Richard Graham Loudwell wanted to live a normal life. He wanted to be happy, settled and free. He didn't have big plans for the future. He just wanted to live a good life. Hints of this appear in 2 news articles from his local paper, the Medway News. 8th of May 1992, Richard posted an advert. It read, Age 47, requires work as a medical estimator or similar. Trained as an engine fitter. Qualifications ONC Maths, Medicals, Tech Drawing, Clean Driving Licence. 20 years experience at Chatham Dockyard. Another 3 years earlier reads, The Children's Society says a big thank you to everyone who helped them out over Christmas, with a special thanks to Richard Loudwell, who through his own efforts raised just over £1,100. He was an ordinary man, leading an ordinary life, who was plagued by strange thoughts and feelings. For years he had lived with his elderly mother at York Farm, a semi-remote cottage on Lower Twiddle Lane in Gillingham. And although he came across as a good but slow boy who helped his mother with the shopping and the cleaning, from 1976 to 1980, he had indecently assaulted a girl under the age of 16. Described as a manic-depressive bisexual with no control over his sexual urges, in 1997, he received the first of 5 informal spells, often as an outpatient, at the psychiatric ward at Medway Hospital, a small rural unit which lacked the funding, staffing and specialist facilities of those in the big city. In 1999, with his sexual urges rising and his mental health spiralling, he pleaded guilty to another sexual assault. He was put on the sex offenders register, sentenced to probation with the condition he attend a sex offenders course. However, he continued to act in an unstable and sexual manner. The law was toothless, his family were helpless, and the mental health services were useless. In 2001, as a voluntary patient, he spent 6 months in a psychiatric hospital. But after his release, he was arrested several times by the police across the next year. In March 2002, he was discharged from Medway Hospital due to sexually inappropriate behaviour and being diagnosed with dementia, depression, and a sickness as yet unspecified. He became a bedbound recluse for several months. By the winter of 2002, being failed by the system and left to his own devices, on the 30th of November 2002, 59-year-old Richard Loudwell was arrested when it was alleged he had raped a 35-year-old man in Canterbury. He wasn't sectioned, or sent to a hospital to be assessed. Instead, he was placed on bail. Like Peter in the days before Nisha's killing, he was mentally unwell and getting no help. Unlike Peter, Richard Loudwell wasn't masking his symptoms or manipulating the system, as he wanted to get well. But to get the help he needed, it would take a brutal murder. An inquest into Richard's case later concluded there was no attempt to understand the relationship between his mental condition and his reasons for offending. Several organizations monitoring him were said to have failed to recognize a series of warning signs. And although Richard's family had pleaded for help and expressed their disquiet, the agencies did not recognize their views or opinions. In the end, the inquest said, lessons were learned, changes were made, but no one was held accountable, even a social worker, as a scapegoat. It concluded the murder wasn't predictable or preventable. But by then, it was all for nothing. Sunday the 25th of April 2004, the Luton ward at Broadmoor. Peter Bryan had been admitted 10 days earlier and released from segregation just 1 week before. He was calm and trusted. He made jokes. He was mildly sarcastic, and occasionally his comments were a little inappropriate. But he wasn't violent or threatening, and was responding well to treatment. In the January 1 year before, Richard had been admitted to Broadmoor for a crime he'd committed 2 years before. Like Peter, he was being mentally assessed and waiting his trial at the Old Bailey. Joan Fisher, a registered mental health nurse and the Luton ward's team leader, told the inquest, Mr. Loudwell was hard to work with. He was generally uncooperative and wasn't liked by any of the other patients. They ignored him, mocked him, bullied him, and described by a senior staff member as the most unpopular patient I have ever met. It was inevitable that sooner or later he would be assaulted. It started early in his stint at Broadmoor, with Peter and the other patients calling Richard a nonce, an acronym marked on prisoners' files, which stands for not a normal courtyard exercise, letting a guard know that an inmate is likely to be attacked. But it's more commonly a slang term for a paedophile. Richard had gone against the rules not to disclose his offence, having been accused of sexually assaulting a child. And yet, without any irony, Peter was also accused of the same. In the days and hours prior, Peter had softened towards Richard. The bullying had become more like banter. Richard was interacting with the others, and he was seen playing cards with the patients. The staff had no inkling that something sinister was brewing, as after 3 whole days in segregation and a rushed assessment, Peter was polite, calm, and compliant, with no clear signs of any mental disorder. It had only been 9 weeks since he had brutally murdered Brian Cherry, stamping on and severing his limbs, smashing open his skull, frying a piece of his brain in butter, and supposedly eating it. Yet that same morning Peter had murdered him, a team of highly experienced psychiatric staff at the Topaz ward in Newham, who had assessed hundreds, if not thousands, of paranoid schizophrenics, had declared he was safe to be released, was no longer a danger to others, and showed no signs of psychosis. That information was in his medical notes. Interviewed after his final murder, Peter told a forensic psychiatrist,
I get these urges, you see. I've had these urges since I first saw him. He's at the bottom of the food chain, old and haggard. He looked like he'd had a good innings. I was just waiting for my chance to get at him. I wanted to kill and eat him. I didn't have much time. If I did, I'd have tried to cook and eat him.
His words are grisly and chilling. But are they true? All of the most sensational elements of this case are retold verbatim and unchecked. We swallow his words like he allegedly swallowed a piece of Bryan's brain. Yet we're as manipulated as his doctors, and by accepting it without any real evidence, and denying the fact that it may be fantasy or staged, we fuel the fire in the minds of his potential future jurors that he's most likely insane. Every blog, podcast, book or documentary written about Peter Bryan either has cannibal in the title, in the first line, or in the opening scene. It's too sensational not to use, even by reputable outlets. Yet they all claim, cannibal ate brain, he killed and ate a man, he had an appetite for killing, with some even giving him the moniker of Cannibal Peter Bryan, barely mentioning his victims or his mental illness. Maybe he is an atypical paranoid schizophrenic, or maybe he isn't. But through biased reporting, all we do is make it easier for him to be charged with manslaughter by diminished responsibility, which is another stab in the heart for his victims' grieving families, rather than being charged with committing what it is, a cold-blooded murder, for which he, if found guilty, would serve his sentence in prison. But will we ever know the truth? It wasn't the sexual assault of a child which led to Richard's incarceration. As like Peter, his crime was horrific. Born on the 4th of June 1920 in Chatham, Kent, Joan Isabel Pearson was one of 2 daughters to Fred and Minnie, alongside her older sister, Winifred. Raised in a small but neat family home at 54 Salisbury Road, life was hard but simple, being the daughter of a housewife and a labourer at Chatham Dockyard. Little is recorded about her life except during wartime. She was a bookbinder's assistant. She married a sailor in 1945, and raising 2 daughters, her life would revolve around her family, her garden, and the church. Widowed in her 60s and living alone, Jean Smyth, as she became, kept herself busy with shopping trips, her circle of friends, her daughters, her grandchildren, and as a trusting lady, she was known to strike up conversations with strangers. Needing less space, she downsized, and as the perfect little home for this 82-year-old pensioner, she moved into a 1-bedroom flat on Wakeley Road in Raynham. As a quiet residential street, lined with 2-story houses from the 1920s and 30s. For Joan, it was safe, warm, and if she ever needed help, upstairs was another pensioner, whose nephew was Richard Loudwell. Monday the 2nd of December 2002 was a typical day for Joan, as she left mid-morning to go shopping. But for Richard, his behaviour had become increasingly bizarre and troubled. That day at York Farm, his mother and sister were at their wits' end, as although he wandered around the garden and house naked, shouting filth and weeping copiously, he was no longer under the psychiatric care of the local hospital. Again, the law was toothless, his family were helpless, and the mental health services were useless. Sometime in the late afternoon, Joan met Richard by chance in the shopping precinct. She was laden down with bags. He had a car that he was still legally allowed to drive, and as she knew him, liked him, and trusted him, being a neighbour's nephew, he drove her back to her home. He'd always been a little unusual, but he showed no signs of a psychotic episode or mental breakdown that afternoon. He was good, kind, childlike, and as he carried her bags in, she had no idea that he would murder her. The initial attack was fast, as his aunt upstairs heard nothing, as Richard rendered Joan unconscious. With his arms or hands, he strangled her until every breath was almost exhausted. Stripping her naked, a post-mortem said her body was covered in bite marks and cigarette burns. And as she lay there, silent, still, and semi-conscious, with his uncontrollable sexual urges raging, Richard raped the old lady. He and Peter Bryan were very different beasts, but having taken Joan to the brink of death, from her home he called 999 and told the police,
I'm on Wakeley Road. My friend, Mrs. Smyth, is in a bad way.
When paramedics called at her flat, he answered her door naked. Rushing Joan to Medway Hospital, his odd behaviour caused concern and the staff alerted the police. When told she was dead, he sobbed,
Oh God, no!
His tears genuine and his emotion true. But his statement was bizarre and delusional. Psychiatrists declared him as unfit to plead and diagnosed him with an abnormality of the mind and possible brain damage. Committed on the 6th of December to Medway Magistrates Court, he was charged with manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility and transferred to Broadmoor to be assessed. In early April 2004, of his own free will, Richard pleaded guilty, and on the 27th of April, he was due to be sentenced to either a life term in a prison or a hospital order at Broadmoor. Again, a mental health system designed to protect patients and the public had failed. It was understaffed, underfunded, it lacked clarity and communication between agencies. It was hard for patients like Richard to get the help that they needed, and impossible for those who manipulated the system to be spotted. In the murder of Joan Smyth, lessons were supposedly learned, but no one was held accountable. And the same mistakes were made, which led to Peter's final murder. Sunday the 25th of April 2004, 6 p.m. The dining room of the Luton ward in Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital. 1 week after Peter's release from segregation, and 2 days before Richard was due to be sentenced. 19 patients were eating dinner, 9 staff were on duty, but due to shortages, only 1 was watching this room. In the hours prior, Richard was said to be happy, cheering and laughing. And as a vulnerable man who had dementia, brain damage, and was described as weak and childlike. For once he wasn't being bullied by Peter and his pals, and everything seemed calm and jovial. Until that one staff member was distracted. At 6:10 p.m, to mask the sound of the beating, of the 8 to 10 inmates who set upon Richard, many were heard to be singing the chirpy, upbeat 1960s pop song, Lazy Sunday by the Small Faces. Staff only became aware when they heard 2 loud bangs coming from the dining room. Racing in, Richard was found on the floor, unconscious, his face covered in blood, and the cord of Peter's jogging bottoms wrapped tightly around his neck. Peter Bryan told the ward leader,
I got him from behind. I put a ligature around his neck so that he wouldn't make any noise, and I smashed his head.
Banging it hard, repeatedly on the table and then on the floor, stating,
I've been thinking about it for a few days.
Then casually adding,
I wanted to eat him.
When restrained, Peter told the staff,
If you hadn't stopped me, I would have eaten him.
A similar quote he said after the murder of Brian Cherry, which was untrue as he'd let Nicola walk free. Again he'd bragged,
I felt excited when I attacked him. I wanted to shag him when he was alive, and also when he was dead. I wanted to cook him, but there was no time. Nor was there any access to cooking equipment. I briefly considered eating him raw,
even though the staff were there in seconds. He even named his next victim, another patient at Broadmoor, stating,
"I want to kill 8 people. I want to be known as a serial killer."
Later telling doctors,
"I'll be released again, even though I've killed 3.
As always, he blamed it on the voices in his head, Caribbean voodoo, a thrill to kill, and that he ate flesh to get power from their souls. Assessed again prior to his trial, psychiatrist Dr. Martin Locke gave the eager tabloids a serving plate of tasty morsels to endlessly repeat, such as,
"Peter Bryan is the most dangerous man I have ever assessed."
and that he told the doctor,
"You look like a brainy chap, and you're quite slim. I think I could take you."
as well as Peter allegedly stating that Brian Cherry's arms and legs tasted like chicken, even though he didn't need them, which the press didn't bother to fact-check. Also recounted verbatim at the trial,
"The case reveals a chilling insight into the mind of a man who has literally developed an appetite for killing. The circumstances of his offending, the inability of the experts to detect when he was at his most dangerous, and his settled desire to cannibalize his victims all combined to make him uniquely dangerous."
which was a quote from the prosecutor, not the defense, who portrayed Peter as a man who the mental health system had failed again and again and again. On the 5th of June 2004, after 41 days in a coma and in a persistent vegetative state, Richard Loudwell died at Frimley Park Hospital. Combined with bronchopneumonia, which he was recovering from, his cause of death was listed as a hypoxic brain injury, ligature strangulation, and blunt trauma to the head. And because of his death, the trial of Joan Smyth was dropped. The file marked deceased. A 13-day inquiry into the care and treatment of Peter Bryan took place in September 2009. It stated he was able to carry out 2 murders in 2 months because of a catalogue of errors, a systemic failure, but concluded the 2 key professionals hadn't the necessary experience to care for such an unusual and complicated patient. Those 2 scapegoats being the psychiatrist and the social worker. Stating that lessons were learned, changes were being made, and apologies were expressed, the inquiry was dismissed as inadequate by Marjorie Wallace, CEO of SANE, who stated, "There's been a trend in these so-called independent inquiries, in order to avoid a culture of blame, not to make those accountable, and make very general observations." This one ordered by the NHS themselves. On the 15th of March 2005, 34-year-old Peter Andrew Bryan was tried at the Old Bailey before Judge Giles Forrester on 2 joint indictments for the murders of Brian Cherry and Richard Loudwell. Led into the dock between 5 guards from Broadmoor, he was heavily sedated, his eyes were fixed and wide, and he sat for hours staring ahead, making not a single sound. Prior to the trial, 4 psychiatrists had certified him as seriously mentally ill, and with both sides accepting his plea of not guilty of murder, but again guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, as Peter had already been convicted a decade earlier of a serious offence. Under the 2 strikes rule under Section 109 of the Powers of Criminal Courts Act 2000, the judge had to impose an automatic life sentence, sending him down on a whole life tariff and declaring, "You will never see freedom." Summing up, Judge Forrester said,
"The earlier treatment at hospital did not cure your disease, and there is no reason to believe a hospital order now will do what it failed to do back in 1994. It is clear that you appear calm and cooperative while harboring bizarre psychotic beliefs.
but that for the safety of prisoners and for the public,
You will never be released because you are too dangerous
The families of Nisha Sheth, Brian Cherry and Richard Loudwell praised his incarceration for life as right, with Brian's brother-in-law stating,
"We're glad he wasn't sent down under the Mental Health Act and able to come out of hospital in 10 years, like last time."
But their celebrations were to be short-lived. On the 31st of January 2006, at the Court of Appeals, Lord Chief Justice Phillips overturned Judge Giles Forrester's whole-life tariff, stating that the judge had failed to adequately reflect Peter's mental illness. He said,
"His mental health will be kept under review for a minimum of 15 years
by psychiatrists, nurses and social workers, or until these professionals deem him no longer a danger to the public." Summer 2025, Broadmoor. Through the triple thick glass of the barred window, 56-year-old Peter savours the warm sun as it dapples across the nature reserve beyond. His crinkly Caribbean skin is greyer, like the stubble of his shaved head. And although he's sporting a grey tracksuit and white t-shirt, he can't go jogging. Like clockwork, a nurse hands him a pill, an antipsychotic. He smiles, swallows it. She notes it on a clipboard, and he thanks her with a cheeky grin and a slightly sarcastic, "Yummy. What's for pudding?" From his pocket, he pulls a carton of his favourite drink, Ribena, and calmly sucks it dry. As although he's separated from the world by walls, doors and guards. He smirks, as he's been in this situation before.